wondering, who is that? I'm Amanda Heineman. I'm not Aiden Mattis. And welcome to the Lore Lodge.
She was very enthusiastic about this. Ladies and gentlemen, I am lacking facial hair, and that makes me deeply unhappy. I can't tell you why I'm lacking facial hair yet, but it's a very cool reason. And for the record, I'd love to tell you why, I'm just legally not allowed to. I thought that today what we should talk about was a very fun topic, something that, just really gets you in a good mood, something that makes you feel warm and fuzzy on the inside, and that thing is cannibalism. So the really neat thing about cannibalism is that nobody thinks it's chill, which is rarely the case. Generally, when you have a subject, there are two sides. But it seems that we've all kind of agreed that cannibalism is a big no-no. Now, in the modern day, unless you're Reza Atslan, then you think that cannibalism is probably a bad thing. He decided to eat human meat for, CNN, which that's kind of weird. I wouldn't do that personally. A lot of stories about cannibalism do tend to stem from a horrific tragedy, an accident, a situation where there was really no other option. But what's very interesting is the way that various cultures around the world have responded to cannibalism. Because some of them are like, you know what? That's a bunch of Chileans who went down in a plane. I understand. And some of them are like, no, if you eat person, you are an immortal monster and you must die.
I wonder what the correlation would be between civilizations that have stable resources for food versus those that are having a difficulty finding it consistently.
See, you would think, you would assume such. You would believe that when you have a stable food resource, you're like, absolutely not. But no. So I don't want to give the image that Native Americans were bad at farming or that they had unstable food sources. That's not the case at all. Just like any other nomadic tribe throughout history, they had some seasons where things were really good, they had some seasons where things were really bad, and that was for mostly the nomadic tribes of Native Americans. You also had fully settled tribes of Native Americans. You had Native Americans who had writing systems. You had Native Americans who were living off in the woods eating berries. So I think there's this whole idea that Native Americans were some sort of monolith, and in reality there was a very broad spectrum of civilization, societal development between Native American tribes, and a lot of the time I think there's a disservice done by assuming that these people were all primitive and defenseless and the Europeans were just big bad meanies. It's like, no, these guys were respectable warriors. They were incredible trappers and traders. They were a truly great set of ethnic groups and nationalities who just happened to have inferior weaponry and numbers. But the point in saying that is to say that by no means were Native Americans a group of people who were incapable of survival. They weren't. They were very good at survival. They also did have less stable food than your average European because agriculture was not quite as universal. Once again, this is not to say that Native Americans were not advanced. It's kind of like if you're playing Civilization and there's the technology tree and they just chose a different set of technologies than we did. But what's weird is, as Aiden mentioned from the Peanut Gallery, that, sometimes you would expect that the groups with a stable food structure would be the ones who are more opposed to cannibalism because, it's going on YouTube too? I can't swear. But in reality, the Native Americans were not vibing with cannibals. And part of the reason we know this is that if you look at, for example, the Northern Paiute are a great example. I think we should center this around the Northern Paiute because it doesn't make sense to center around the Northern Paiute. We'll talk about a few different people here. Anyway, the Northern Paiute, one of the things they're the most disgusted with in all of their oral histories is cannibalism. There's this guy, Numuzoho, who stalks around, and he's like, hey, why are you crying? It doesn't matter, you're dead now, I'm gonna grind you in a pestle. Yeah, Numuzoho, the Paiute, mythological cannibal, he just goes around saying, pss, pss, eyes ought to be dry, and then people die. This Numuzoho guy is not cool. And Numuzoho, so Numu means the people, means us. It's most of the Native American groups, their term for them is the people, which is very similar to how it is basically everywhere on the planet. The original name for Britain comes from Britannia, which was the Roman province. Before that, it was Britannia, which was the what they called themselves, which was based. Well, that's what the Greeks thought they called themselves. What they actually called themselves was Prythin or Prythin, to Prydain, to give you a more accurate one. But that became Britannia and then Britain. But the word itself means us. So it's the same thing with if you look at the Montagnais, they're the Innu, that means the people. The Navajo were originally the Dene, that means the people. The Paiute or the Numu, that means the people. But with the Paiute, with their Numu Zoho legend, he's not a cool dude, and their whole origin story for their tribe begins with him and his buddies who live with beaver. They all just kill all the people in the area, and then the Pit River and the Paiute spring out of the whole situation. But the Paiute go on much later on to have this whole big kerfuffle with the Site Ka. And the Site Ka, or the Numa Takata, as they're called by the Kup Takata. Takata seems to mean to eat, and then the word before it is what they eat. Kup means ground squirrel. The Kiwi means fish, and Numa means human, so the man-eaters. Yeah, so fun. But in the Paiute tradition, and this is, listen, if you want me to sit there and analyze the other possibilities, we have a whole video on YouTube where I do that. But my point in saying this is, in the Paiute tradition, the Numa Takata, the Site Ka, the red-haired cannibal giants of Lovelock Cave, the thing that makes them truly despicable and irredeemable is that they eat people. And the Paiute throughout the story are kind of like, hey, listen, you guys are really, really chill generally, but we're really not vibing with the part where you exhume our bodies from our graves and then make a stew out of them. Part of the reason I bring up the Paiute, however, is that obviously I've talked about the Site Ka. The whole story is pretty simple. There's a group of cannibals. The cannibals terrorize the Paiute. The Paiute get kind of sick of being terrorized by the cannibals. They go over and they're like, hey, stop eating us. And the cannibals are like, no. So they fight a 3-year-long war. It ravages all over the Humboldt River and Carson Sink and all of that. I almost spilled the whiskey. Anyway, the point is, they drive them into the lake, and then they're like, wait, we're on a lake. We got to get out of this lake. And then the Site Ka try to get off the lake, but the Paiute are like, oh, hell no, and just kill them. But eventually they manage to get off the lake, and they run up into a mountain. And then they're in the mountain, and they're like, we're going to stay in this mountain. This mountain's vibes. But the Paiute are like, no. And they start putting wood in front of the cave. And the Site Ka are like, well, I want this wood. And the Paiute are like, well, here's more wood. And the Site Ka are like, well, I want more wood. And then the cave's full of wood. And the Paiute are like, yo, well, you know what? If you won't stop eating people, then we're just gonna set the wood on fire. And the Site Ka are like, well, you wouldn't do that. And then they did. Part of the reason I bring this up is because we've talked about cannibalism on a number of occasions on the channel, and one of the more interesting ones is a video we haven't even released yet, which is the Donner Party. A lot of people think we covered the Donner Party, but we didn't. I mean, by the time this video is out, we may have. We'll be getting close to it. We'll be almost there. But yeah, it's been like over 2 years and we haven't done the Donner Party. We did a podcast episode where I talked about it. I don't know why I never talked about it at length before. But I was able to find their diaries, but that's not really the point. The point here is in the Sarah Winnemucca, one of the Native American storytellers, in her account of the Site Ka War, she also, let me backtrack a little bit. She wrote a book called Life Among the Paiutes, and in that book, she discusses, words are escaping me. She mentions at one point that when the white people first started to come, her people thought they were cannibals. And if you read the story of the Donner Party, if you listen to the story of the Donner Party as we're going to be presenting it, you'll learn that one of the groups who caused the most problems for the Donner Party was in fact the Northern Paiute. They stole like so many cattle, Aiden. Like just a deeply unfortunate number of cattle. Dozens. No, the Paiute stole the cattle from the Donner Party. Which, like, I kind of get it. On the one hand, it's like, who are these strange people that are crossing our land? But they weren't even settling in Paiute territory. They were heading on through. It was like they were just passing through, and the Paiute were like, absolutely not.
There are so many tolls on this road, you have no idea.
It's like, there is a toll, and the toll is 24 cattle. The Paiute were a bit of a problem for them. Other Native American tribes they had much better experiences with. It's very fun reading about the Lewis and Clark expedition too, and kind of like this was 40 years earlier, and they're just meeting all of these groups that have never met Americans before. It's just like, it's like, yes, I understand we're speaking the same language as the English, but we're not them. Like, also, we bought the land you live on from France, and now we're in charge. And that the Lakota did not take kindly to that.
Shocking.
No, not. They did not like that. They were not fans.
Couldn't imagine.
They were kind of like, we weren't even aware that the French owned this land in the first place.
Who are the French?
And they knew who the French were. They just didn't care, and they were powerful enough to not care. What's really impressive about the Lakota when they encountered the United States is exactly how bullish they were, considering there were about 8,000 of them.
Really?
Uh-huh. There had been 28,000 when the French encountered them.
I mean, to be fair, you can consider a very similar circumstance with the colonists who decided to rise up against Great Britain.
Sure, we had a much better shot.
Oh, 100%.
There's a moment, I think it's the Lakota. I'm mostly sure it's the Lakota, but it might be another tribe. But I'm pretty sure it's the Lakota that Lewis and Clark ran into. And because they had two feuding chiefs at the time who were trying to assert their dominance over the tribe, the Lewis and Clark expedition almost ended immediately in a war with the Lakota. Because they got to Lakota, I'm pretty sure this was the Lakota, but they got to their territory, and they gave one of the chiefs a gift before giving the other chief a gift, and the second chief took offense to that. And so they ended up trying to give both chiefs gifts, and then they wanted to continue up the river, but the chiefs were both like, well, we want more gifts. I want more gifts than him. Like, you got to show me that you like me better than him. And Lewis and Clark were finally like, absolutely not. We're not giving you any. We don't have enough for this. We have to get all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so they get to this point where basically the most important thing Thomas Jefferson said to these two men was, please be cautious. Don't start any wars. And like 2 weeks into the trip, I think it's Meriwether Clark is like, it's either, oh God, is it Lewis or is it Clark? I can't remember. One of them, they're having this argument with the two chiefs, and they're like, present arms. It's just so Lewis and Clark's expedition just suddenly lowers their rifles or their muskets at all of the Native Americans. The Native Americans are like, with the bows, and they're all just standing on this boat. I think it's Lewis was armed with one of the swivel cannons, pointing it at them. The whole situation is just so ridiculous because the one thing Thomas Jefferson wanted was for them to not start any wars. And they almost started a war with the Lakota, and had they started a war with the Lakota, then in the War of 1812, the Lakota would have sided with the British, and we probably would have lost, actually. So, this one moment almost changed the course of history forever. So the good news is that Lewis and Clark's expedition did not start a war with all of the Native Americans, but it did open a pathway west which caused a whole bunch of wars with Native Americans that didn't all happen at the same time. But eventually they were able to blaze this really cool little thing called the Oregon Trail, where just so many people died and it was the hardest video game ever created.
Everyone got dysentery.
Everyone got dysentery. But the Oregon Trail, as a concept, I don't know about everybody else, but I will say this much. In my brain, and I'm an educated historian. I have degrees. I had no idea. Like, I had a general sense that it was the 19th century, but if you had asked me a year ago when the Oregon Trail happened, I would have had a legitimately difficult time telling you. Like, I understand that the gold rush was like 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, but the Oregon Trail, to me, for some reason, I would have had to like triangulate the time period based on other things I knew happened.
I figured it was like 1820s-ish.
Yeah, no, way too early.
Really?
1840s.
Really?
Yeah, you start to see the true use of the Oregon Trail, not just a few settlers going west to settle in Mexican territory, but like the Oregon Trail, the wagon trains, that's the 1840s. And it's really like, the Paiute, for example, I don't think encountered Americans until the 1820s or 30s. And then by the 1840s, you've got wagon trains that are all going to Mexican territory. So the Donner Party was one of those groups. And part of the issue with the Donner Party was there was an established Oregon Trail route that worked. Everyone knew it worked. It took a while. It wasn't comfortable. You weren't going to have a good time, but you would live. And that route took you up through a place called Fort Hall, Idaho, and then south onto the California Trail, southwest onto the California Trail. But this guy named Lanford Hastings, I'm not sure quite how to describe him, what to compare him to, but he was one of these Old West adventurers, and he went out, and he was like, I'm going to find a new way. I'm going to publish a guide to the West. And he did. But the problem was, he included in that guide a suggestion that people on the Oregon Trail, instead of taking the normal trail route and going up to Fort Hall, following the Oregon Trail, and departing from it to go onto the California Trail southwest at Fort Hall, he was like, how about instead of that, we depart the Oregon Trail at Fort Bridger, Wyoming? And a lot of people were like, go on. He goes, and it's going to go southwest. And they went, And he goes, to a Great Salt Lake. And they were like, there's no Mormons there yet. Because there weren't. And he created what is called Hastings Cutoff, which rather than going north of Salt Lake, goes south of the Great Salt Lake. After going south of the Great Salt Lake and through present-day Salt Lake City, it heads west across the Salt Lake Desert, the Great Salt Desert, the Salt Flats, whatever the hell it's called. So, this does, on the one hand, shave 300, 400 miles off of your trip, and that should save you several weeks, if not a couple of months. When the Donner Party departed at Fort Bridger onto what was called Hastings Cutoff, they thought that it was going to save them several weeks and that it would take them about 7 weeks to make the entire trip into California from Fort Bridger. The problem with that was that there was a desert that otherwise wouldn't have been there, and also Lanford Hastings was supposed to guide them along the route, but left a week early, and also suggested they don't take Weber Canyon, which is what everybody else took, and he was like, why don't you blaze a trail this way instead, which added several weeks to the trip, and then by the time they got to the desert, they were already a month behind, I think, a couple of weeks behind to a month behind. By the time they make it through the desert, and actually rejoin the California Trail in Nevada, they were a full month behind, which meant that by the time that they got to, oh, by the way, when they were crossing the deserts between the Great Salt Lake, the Salt Flats, that desert, and then also the desert between Humboldt, Sink, and Reno, Nevada, between those two, they lost dozens of cattle. Like, just dozens of cattle. So many oxen. So, the party does eventually get to Reno, Nevada, which was not Reno, Nevada yet. Also, Salt Lake wasn't there. Salt Lake City, not there yet. Funny fact, the Donner Party, they did this whole thing where a bunch of them died. It was a really bad time. But the trail they blazed is the trail the Mormons took to found Salt Lake City.
Really?
The Donner Party created the trail that the Mormons took to reach Salt Lake City. But it gets better. It gets better here. Because part of the reason I'm telling the Donner Party story is to do with the Northern Paiute and the Sarah Winnemucca story and the red-haired cannibals, because it all connects. Because in Sarah Winnemucca's account, the first time the Paiute started to really realize white people were a thing, they were like, oh yeah, didn't you hear? They ate each other up in the mountains last year. Sarah Winnemucca was born in 1844, and she's recounting a tale from her childhood wherein the old women of the tribe were gossiping about how the white people are cannibals because they ate each other in the mountains last year, which, 1844, she was a young child, Donner Party, 1846. She's talking about the Donner Party. I have never seen anyone point out that connection. And we pointed it out in the C-Take-A video.
Yeah.
We're that good. So, anyway, yeah, with the whole Donner Party situation, there were just a number of issues they ran into, including not planning for the desert, trusting a local con man, and the Mexican-American War. Yeah, the Mexican-American War is also involved. I'm so excited about the Donner Party video. This is going to be so much fun. There's so much information. Yeah, James Reed, one of the members of the Donner Party, he was trying to get, help for the Donner Party, but one of the ways he was trying to do that was by joining the volunteers fighting against Mexico under Captain Fremont. But I think his idea was well, Captain Fremont's really influential. If we can get him on our side, we can get the rescue party to go. But he got kind of sidetracked fighting the Mexicans.
It happens.
You know, it happens. Sometimes you're trying to rescue your family in the mountains, and unfortunately, you have to go to war with Mexico. This is all going one direction, which is more cannibalism, because I'm bringing up the Wachuge next. That's right. Get ready. Let's go. How am I going to do that? That's right. Louis Keseberg from the Donner Party. What did he do? Ate people. Why'd he eat people? Because he was stuck at camp. You know who else ate people? The entire rest of the Donner Party who went through the mountains and survived, because they became known as the Forlorn Hope. And this one dude, Franklin Graves, which is a really appropriate name for the guy that died first. But anyway, he's like, he's talking to his daughter, and he's like, but actually this guy named Patrick Dolan suggested they eat each other, and then he died and got eaten. But yeah, it was a whole thing. But anyway, Franklin Graves is like gonna die, and he calls over his daughter Mary, and he's like, Mary, my child, do what you must to survive. Eat of my flesh. She didn't. She ate somebody else, and then somebody else ate. They worked it out. They weren't monsters. They were like, I'm not going to make anybody eat their family. But yeah, so the Forlorn Hope Party actually makes it to Johnson's Ranch. They're chill. They're good. Well, most of them died, actually. But aside from that, 16 set off, like 5 made it back. Oh, yeah.
Did they have any weapons with them? Like, did anybody know how to hunt?
Oh, yeah. They just failed at it. Yeah, William Eddy actually killed an 800-pound grizzly bear, and they still died.
How?
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't wait for this video.
I'm so excited about this. There's a reason I have gone so in-depth on this, and that it's taken me like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh my god.
this is gonna be like the Boy in the Box video in terms of detail, and I'm hoping it's gonna have the same impact for our channel.
Yeah.
Because the Boy in the Box video was huge for us. So I'm hoping that this is one of those things where it's like we have done it better than anybody else has done it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so anyway, but yeah, nobody from the Forlorn Hope group turned into like a Wendigo or anything, which is pretty chill. That's vibes. But then back at camp, this dude named Louis Keseberg, who was German, so you know this story's not going anywhere good. Keseberg had kind of been a pain in the ass the whole time and may or may not have murdered another dude, but nobody really knows for sure. The accounts are really weird, and you can tell that there was some enmity even after everything happened, because in the various accounts, certain people blame others for certain things, and then William Eddy is like, I just tried to do the right thing, man, and everybody else is like, why are you listening to anything Eddy said? Like... It's not very cool. Also, James Reed got exiled for killing somebody, but it seems like it might have been completely justified, but then he went and tried to get help, but then got caught up in the Mexican-American War. The Donner Party story always gets told as just being like the part where they're stuck at Truckee Lake and the part where a bunch of them tried to go through the mountains, and everybody leaves out all the wild stuff that happened in conjunction with it. Like, whew. Anyway, yeah, so Louis Keseberg, he waited longer than just about anybody else to eat somebody. He waited until it was, you know, this was months of surviving on scraps of oxhide. Like, this guy waited a long time. And if I remember correctly, as the story goes, he was one of 2 people left. As the story goes... I haven't gotten to this part of my research yet, but I remember it from the last time we talked about it on the podcast. He waited until the last other person in camp died before he ate human flesh. He's the only one from the group who's reported to have anything resembling Wendigo psychosis. Now, for those who don't know, Wendigo psychosis is typically considered to be a culture-bound disease of the Algonquin people, which is one of the broad ethnic groups of Native Americans, but... When I first heard the term culture-bound disease, it kind of came... my immediate assumption was that sounds kind of like racism, to be honest. Like saying, oh, they only have this disease because they're primitive savages. And I was like, that's not cool and sounds outdated. But then I read up on it some more from some actual rather progressive historians and anthropologists. And it turns out that it is culture-bound, but in a very positive way. Which is that compared to most other groups, the Algonquin consider cannibalism to be such a horrific crime against humanity that no sane person in control of their own actions could possibly do it. So their only opinion when somebody killed somebody else was that and ate them was that this person must be either possessed by a demonic spirit or irredeemably insane.
I wonder if due to that cultural significance within their group, if that knowledge of the individual within that group, understanding is, so let me put this in a more clear manner. I wonder if for individuals within that culture, if and when they are within that scenario where they've been pushed to the point where they have to do that, if having been raised with that mindset then makes them believe the only way I could have done that, almost like a severe case of PTSD, where they start to believe that I must be this monstrous thing if I did that.
Precisely, that's the idea, is that even the people who commit the act feel like, oh, I'm possessed by the Wendigo spirit, I must eat flesh.
Yeah.
And the other people of the tribe are like, well, he ate a human, he must be possessed by the Wendigo spirit, the only way to solve this is to kill him. So that's the way in which it's culture bound, is that they have such a negative opinion of cannibalism beyond really anything I've come across from any other group that I've studied, and I have not studied every group. But, of the groups I've studied, is particularly the Native Americans of the northern U.S. and Canada, who are the most culturally opposed to cannibalism. But the moment somebody does it, that person is gone. They are no longer human. They are an enemy of the people. They must be killed, which I found very interesting. I think that's fascinating. And even with the Donner Party, we're not even talking about the two Native Americans who were accompanying them were Luis and Salvador, and they were Californian. I don't know exactly what tribe. It's never recorded, but they were from a California tribe of natives. And once you get south of the north, what you would consider the north, once you get below that, you start to see cannibalism not be quite as much of a taboo. It's still gross, but it's not the sort of taboo it is among the Algonquin and the Dene. Instead, it's kind of like, we don't like that. Like, there were cannibals in the past. They were really bad. We don't want to bring that back. That's kind of what you get from the Paiute. I don't know quite as much about the people who you get further south and west of that. Again, I'm still working on my research. But the point here that I'm trying to get across is with the Donner Party, Luis and Salvador, the natives, lasted 2 days longer than anybody else before they were finally recorded by anybody to have eaten human flesh. So they waited 2 days longer than everyone else can consider. This wasn't that they had full rations and then went 2 days without eating. This isn't that they had full rations, went 4 days without eating, and everybody else went 2. They were subsisting on an ounce of meat per day for a week before people started eating flesh. And then it was another few days before the last of the whites broke, and then another 2 days after that before Luis and Salvador broke. So that is how culturally taboo cannibalism is amongst the Native Americans. So that's why you see these stories with the Wendigo and the Wachuge, who's kind of a little bit more sentient than the Wendigo. Stories of the Wachuge usually involve them thinking and planning and plotting, being cognizant and aware and making their own decisions, whereas Wendigos are kind of driven more by impulse. If you look at some of the stories that are more direct of Wendigos rather than the folklore stuff, but the actual historical accounts of executions of Wendigos, then you start to see something a little bit different, which is that you've got like, what am I trying to say here? They're very impulsive. They're insane. It's clearly that the person is broken. And I think that's part of it, is that, yes, part of it is that they had this idea that if you did that, you must be insane. But also, because of the cultural taboo, these people would wait so long to finally break that they would be psychotic, that they would be at the end of their wits. So a Wendigo was a person who had both gone through extraordinary hunger and mental stress at the thought of becoming a Wendigo, and then broke psychologically as well. So it's like, it's a very interesting culture-bound disease, but it makes sense that it's culture-bound, and that's not necessarily a negative here. It just means that this is a group of people who everyone sees cannibalism as bad. Almost everybody. There's a few places in the world where cannibalism is not considered horrible. But almost everyone on Earth considers cannibalism to be awful, and these people consider it even more awful than the rest of us. So, yes, culture bound, but in a very positive light, which I think is important. And you know, it's when you do get to the execution story, it's so funny because they always come from Europeans. It's always Europeans or Americans doing the execution stories. And hang on. One of my favorites. I learned about this while we were doing the video on the Wachugate. This one English explorer, he's hanging with some natives and just vibing, learning about them, living with them. And there's a famine and they go to fish by a lake. And a dude shows up at the lake and he's haggard. He's so hungry. He's not doing good at all. And he's like, hey, please, I had to leave my family behind because they were all too weak to travel. I was the only one who could continue on. Please feed me. And the Englishman observing this is like, we should probably feed him. And all the natives are like, something's not right here. He's like, what do you mean? What's going on? I'm out of the loop. Sorry. I'm out of the loop, innit? Yeah, so he's kind of understand. And of course, this is all written in later, so he's had time to digest. But you can tell that he's kind of confused about why they're approaching this in this situation. And for the natives, they're looking at this guy who just crawled out of the woods, barely alive, and seems kind of a little bit unstable. And they have these stories, and so they're pretty skeptical of him at first. They start asking questions, and they send a party back to follow his trail. Native Americans, fantastic trackers. Just like one of the things that comes up in stories of them from the colonial period, the Old West, all of that, natives are like the best trackers in the world. Like if you were playing like a fantasy RPG and you based a group, like one of the races off of Native Americans, tracking would be through the roof. Like tracking, encryption, like there's all these really cool stories with Native Americans of the stuff that they just excelled at, that for whatever reason, the way that they had lived made them incredibly talented at things that Europeans and Americans had to practice, just lifetimes, that just were second nature. You would have frontiersmen coming across the plains and the forests of the frontier, and the Native Americans would be like, oh, you're lost, let me help you, and then guide them through totally faceless terrain with no trouble whatsoever. It was just this innate sense of direction. Like, it's really incredible, it's impressive, and it drives me insane that historians and archaeologists back at the time when there were people to speak to didn't record this stuff. Like, we could have known so much. There could have been so much history preserved, and we just did not do it. I hope time travel happens at some point. If time travel happens within my lifetime, I want to go back and talk to the Lakota, the Paiute, the Klamath, the Iroquois, just all of it. There's so much we don't know because nobody knew the right questions to ask, and we could learn so much. Oh.
I want to know what it meant when they said they take apes in the mountains.
I want to know what they meant when they said they take apes in the mountains. Who were the apes, Aiden? They're putting apes in the mountains.
Bring me to the Saskets.
God, the Saskets one's cool too. Like, how do you... I think this is what drives me insane is, this video is mostly about cannibalism, but let me gush for a second. The insane part of all of this is that if you look at the stories of Bigfoot and the Wendigo and all of that, and you do the same, you treat it the same way we treat our own stories as European Americans. Obviously, when we look at ogres and goblins and elves and all that, we ask the question, like, okay, where'd this come from? What was the real root of this that eventually, over time, snowballed into orcs? Like, I think when you do that with stories from the indigenous people of the Americas, you start to get these little nuggets that seem less like myth and more like history, more like archaeology. When you hear a story of, oh, well, there's these larger people who once lived off in the mountains, who were hairier than us and stronger than us and had higher pitched voices. And they were not quite as, they didn't live in settlements, they lived in caves. Well, then you ask the question, were there other hominids here? Because we once thought it was just us and Neanderthals, and then it was us and Neanderthals and Denisovans. What if it's us and Neanderthals and Denisovans and Saskets? And we have these stories of the red-haired giants, the Sitekov Lovelock Cave. Maybe that story is only 3 to 5 generations back. Maybe it's many hundred years, as Sarah Winnemucca said. Maybe it's 3,000 years. And the timeline has just condensed because all of this was oral history. What if there are things hidden within these legends in the same way that there are things hidden within European and African and Asian legends that are hinting at a period of our past that we just don't understand yet? Because even last year, they hadn't found perfect evidence, confirmation, that there were people here before 13,500 years ago. And then it doubled in 2022 to 22,500 years ago. What if it's 50? What if it's 100? There were mammoths until 4,000 years ago. How do we know there weren't people until 20,000 years ago who weren't us? And it could just all be hidden within these stories that are in plain sight, and we're just not looking at it because, on the one hand, don't question it, it's their stories. Just take them as they believe them. Believe everything they say. Because that's not good. That's not how these stories were meant to be told or understood. It also infantilizes an entire group of people and says, they're primitive. Let them have their stories. We're better than them. No! Their stories are interesting and they're based off of something and they mean something and they're important. So let's ask them about the stories, let's understand the stories, let's compare the stories to the archaeological record, and maybe, just maybe, a story from, ancient Shasta legend tells us about the people who were here before the Shasta, the people who were here before the Klamath, the people who were here before the Dene. Let's start taking these people seriously. Let's stop acting like it's this weird set of, rules that we've got to pretend that they're not as valid as we are in every single possible way. That their stories, when we listen to something that a Paiute or an Algonquin or an Iroquois or a Cherokee tells us about their ancient history, their mythology, we should look at it the same way we look at the Greek, at the Jewish, at the Islamic, at the Hindu. We should look at all of it just like that. Because every single one of those stories from our ancient traditions across the old world, all of them are rooted in truth. There is some truth to something back there. And that truth might even be just what people used to believe, and that tells us something. But we keep treating, some of these like Native American and South American and African tribal legends like they're some sort of, other class of mythology, when in reality all of this folklore, what does the word folklore mean? Do you know? It's Germanic. Lore is a word meaning story, and folk is the people, the story of the people. It's the story as told by the people. It's not history. History and folklore as terms actually do mean the same thing. History is to understand the past, folklore is the story of the people, which you could argue those are the same definition. The difference is that one is technically considered more the study of mythology, whereas one is constructing the most accurate narrative possible. That's kind of where you look at the differences. Let's understand the narrative, or let's understand the story as well as possible, and this one is, let's understand what actually happened as well as possible. Those are the differences. But if we start taking both of those approaches, I think there's a lot to be understood and a lot to be learned, and you don't need to have this weird kind of like relationship. I want to sit at a table across from somebody who grew up with the stories from, the Aztecs. I don't want him to tell me about where his people came from and that giant lake to the north where all the tribes lived. And I want to tell him about where the Jews came from and how they became the Christians. I want to exchange those stories, see the similarities, the differences, catalog them, and have conversations about it. Because at the end of the day, what really matters is that we have all of these rich conversations, these rich understandings, and we become better, well-rounded people. We understand one another better. And I think that's been lost in a major way. Anyway, I'm drunk and rambling. I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.